Hey everyone, welcome back to PolyCosm. In this video, I'll be taking the Nurbek sketch from part 1 and Christina's lantern render from part 2 to create a final illustration for Nurbek himself. I'll go over a workflow I tend to follow for most of my character design work and explain why I like this method. We'll also have a look at how to explore and find a good color scheme for your character. I think a lot of people suffer from choice paralysis when it comes to this stage, so hopefully I'll be able to simplify the process down a little. Right, let's get right into it. First, I'm going to go over my sketch to get the final line art that I'll be working with. I just lower the opacity of the sketch, create a new layer on top, and I just get drawing. The most challenging part while trying to get the clean line art is to be able to keep the dynamism of the original sketch. It's very easy to lose that and make the final line art come out very static and sorta boring. But knowing when to speed up and slow down your drawing pace really helps when it comes to retaining that energy, and most of that knowledge comes with experience. I also find it useful to try and stay fairly zoomed out at this stage. Zooming in too much prevents you from seeing the bigger picture, and you might end up getting lost trying to draw that perfect line without any context. To be able to communicate a sense of three-dimensionality and a sense of depth while working with just line art, you need to really understand how to use line weight accurately. Whenever you have an overlapping shape, a thicker line will help bring a shape forward, and a thinner line will help push the other shape back. If you are not very experienced with drawing, it might be a good idea to draw your first pass with a fine line, then go over that to thicken certain parts to create that sense of depth. I usually work with a range of line quality from the very beginning, but you'll see me go over parts later on to thicken them, or maybe gently erase them to push them back. Also, try to keep your thick dark lines on the shadow side as much as possible. That way, you can imply a really dark drop shadow. When it comes to drawing fabric, simplifying the folds is really essential. A lot of beginners think they need to draw every line of fold that they see, but most of the time that ends up looking just really odd. Use the fold lines to create tension around joints and where the fabric will have force applied to it. For example, when it goes under a tight belt that's holding it in place. Understanding gesture and practicing gesture drawing can also really help with your fold drawing skills. Okay, this might sound a little weird, but I really like drawing these small details like stitching on clothing, and it really helps sell the believability of the outfit. Although this can be fairly time-consuming to do, there are certain methods that can help save time. I'll show you guys here one that I use regularly. First, create a new layer, then double-click it to bring this layer style window. Then go to stroke style and click the checkbox to activate it. Now, with that layer style on, I make sure I have the color white selected, or whatever background color you are using, so when you make a mark, you don't see that mark that you are making, but the outline that is created with the stroke effect around it. You can go back and adjust the thickness of the stroke to suit your purposes. You can also change the color of the stroke to make sure it's not too distracting. For this to work properly, you need to be using a brush that is completely opaque, meaning the transfer should be turned off. As I'm drawing his face, I'm aware that this area is going to be the main focal point. This means this area should have the most amount of detail. I'm constantly thinking about where I should spend most time to add detail and where I should keep the drawing to a minimum to imply detail with just a few loose marks. Once I have the majority of the drawing done, I use the selection tools and put a layer of solid color underneath it. I'm going to use this as my base for the coloring stage. It also helps me keep my painting tidy in the later stages by having a silhouette of the character like this. Now, I bring in a render of the lantern that Christina has very kindly provided and just adjust that around to match my sketch as closely as possible. I'm not a fan of tracing at all, but in this case, I'm going to go over the lantern very quickly to make sure I have a subtle line art of it as well. This will help unify the different assets in the final artwork. Okay, it's time to drop some color in. Doing this really roughly right now because I'm still not sure about the color scheme yet. I just want to have a base color down for each individual part so I can easily adjust them later on. Once I have something half decent looking, I just create a copy of the whole group, then select the color I want to change with the magic wand tool. If you uncheck the box next to contiguous, I really have no idea how it is pronounced, but if you do that, then you'll be able to select that color everywhere in that layer. Afterwards, press Ctrl H or Command H if you are working on a Mac to hide your selection. Then I just open the hue saturation window and start moving these sliders around looking for color schemes that I think will fit the character. I think this is a good place to talk about this cool tool that I tend to use when I'm trying to come up with color schemes. This is the color wheel on Adobe's website, and it's pretty handy when you don't have a specific reference for a color palette. It offers all these different color scheme options here, and you can even save your color scheme into your library so you can access it again later. Now, to start with, we need a base color to create our palette around. So I'm going to pick this orange from Nurbek and use that as our base color. I open the color picker window and copy the hex number for this color that you can find right over here. I go to the color wheel and paste that number there and press enter. And now that color is set as my base color, and you can see the first color scheme here right away. This is the analogous scheme, which is, as you can see, a very limited palette. You can just flick through these different schemes to see if any of these are useful to you. Triad is a good one. I tend to like that scheme a lot. You also have complementary, of course, which gives you the color on the opposite side of the color wheel, and a bunch of other ones that can be useful for a variety of scenarios. You don't have to stick to the exact colors you get here either. This can be all just a starting point. For example, for Nurbek, I picked this purple here and darkened it, and also made it a little cooler to get the color I used for the fabric draped over him. Similar with his trousers, where I took this green, darkened and desaturated it to get this color. And this brown here provided the base for the rest. If you find yourself stuck trying to come up with color schemes, I recommend trying out this tool. Alright, let's get back to Nurbek. Christina and I talked over all the options, tweaked the colors around, and ended up with this one as our final. I'm just going to clean it up a little. I'm also going to add some color variation and texturing. The reason we decided to go with this color scheme was that it complemented the lantern quite well, but also made Nurbek stand out from it. It was also loosely inspired by the colors seen on nomadic tribes' clothing. We didn't want Nurbek to be too colorful, but have enough color information in him to make him pop out just a tiny bit. I really like showing some wear and tear on the clothing and the gear like this. I think it adds a lot of personality to the character. I'll be adding more details later on. This is just to give me a solid base to work with. Before I proceed any further, I want to add some color to the line art, as I think using pure black can make things look a bit flat. I just go to my line art layer and open the hue saturation window again. Turn on the colorize, and now you can add some color to the line art. You might have to turn up the lightness a little to be able to see the color change at first. I think a warm color will look better, so I'm going with something like this. Then switch the layer mode to multiply, and you can see the slight hint of color at work. I'm going to add a similar color to the stroke effect as well to make sure it's all consistent. Time to get into adding some lighting. I use solid color layers a lot for this stage. I'm thinking of going warm with the shadows and lighting Nurbek with a cool light. So I pick a warm and fairly desaturated color. Then I clip mask that to my base and set it to multiply. And now I can just pick this mask on this layer and paint light on him. It's pretty cool, huh? I am just going to go ahead and block out my main light and shadow shapes before I move on to the next step. To add the rim light coming from the lantern, I use the same technique as before, except this time I set the layer mode to screen. I'm also going to lower the opacity and flow a bit to get something that's not too strong. We have the basic light setup done now. I can polish this up a little and call this done if I wanted to. I mean, we got a cool cel-shaded look going on here, but I wanted to have something that looks more painted. So we are moving ahead with doing an ambient occlusion pass. This is something I learned from an old Alex Negreo tutorial like a long time ago. It's a cool way to add that extra bit of realism. I just create a multiply layer and paint in the shadows that are going to exist in the darkest parts of the image. These are the areas where no light source will be able to get to. This is supposed to be a very subtle pass though, so just be careful and make sure you are not going too overboard with it. I think this is good enough for now, and you can see how much depth it adds to the image. Next step is to add that cool tint to the light areas. So I hold down Command or Control and click the mask on my shadow layer. Then I create a new solid color layer, select the mask, and press Command-I or Control-I to invert it. I'm going to pick a nice cool color and set the layer blending to soft light. I'm just going to erase the parts that affect the lantern's light and then adjust the opacity and flow settings until I get something that I like. And this is pretty much how I create the base of my painting. Let's stop here for a second and take a closer look at how all those layers are working together to create my painting base. As you can see, we have our flat colors here with some texture information, some slight color variation. Then I've put my main light source on the character to show all the main forms. But now we have the shadow areas blending with the lantern too much. So I'm gonna be adding the rim light layer to help me pop those edges out. And also, as you can see, this makes sense, of course, because there will be light coming from the lantern and filling those shadows a bit. Then we have this subtle addition of that cool light into the light areas. And as you can see, this is very subtle. And it's mostly there to add the temperature shift from light to shadow. For certain projects, I might call the concept finish at this stage, but since I'm going to be rendering this further, I'm adding extra depth with the ambient occlusion pass here. Now that I have all the information that I need, I can just start rendering and take this as far as I can. From this point on, it's a lot of blending, painting, and texturing. As you can see, I added a rough background to create some mood and give Nurbek some context. To be able to get accurate looking cast shadows on the ground, I asked Christina for a quick render of the lantern. I'm not going to use this render as it is because there is just way too much information on it, but I'll be painting over parts of it to make sure it's not pulling the attention away from the character. After some finishing touches and last-minute adjustments, here's the final artwork for Nurbek. I think this turned out looking pretty decent, especially with the added environment around him. Moving forward with our project, we can always refer back to this concept to make sure we are not straying away from our initial mood for our character and the world he inhabits. And of course, I had to do a quick turnaround drawing as well, so Christina can have an easier time with her sculpt. And that's it for this video, but we are not even close to being done with this project. We've got a lot more cool stuff coming up, so please stay tuned everyone. We'll be back next week with a quick tips video from Christina, which I'm sure is going to be super informative as usual, so make sure you check that out. Thanks for your time, and we'll see you next week. Bye everyone.